Hey Embrace, I wanted to let you know next Sunday we are starting up our brand new message series for Christmas called To From. This Christmas, if you find yourself disappointed, fearful, looking or searching for purpose in life, know that you are not alone. Different people in the Christmas story felt the exact same way. I can't wait to jump into this brand new series. Just to say it, over the last few weeks, we've been talking about relentlessly reaching the next person for Jesus. Well, Christmas season is a time of the year that our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers are more open to God and are looking for a church to check out. And so I want to challenge all of us who call Embrace home to invite our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, and just tell them, hey, this Christmas, I would love to have you join me at my church. I can't wait to see how God will use these simple invitations. Last Christmas, we did something called a reverse offering, where we gave out envelopes to everyone who came, and inside the envelopes, it was filled with cash to go do Jesus stuff. Well, I don't want to say that this coming Sunday we're doing a reverse offering, but I will say you do not want to miss this coming Sunday. Wink, wink, all right? Last thing today, we have the huge honor of being able to hear from one of our very own. He's our 57th Street campus pastor. His name is Brian Rock. If you would, at all campuses and network churches, put it up and welcome Brian.
All right, welcome Embrace. That's a rookie mistake. Never clap for the pastor before he speaks. You don't know what I'm going to say. Who knows? Hey, if we haven't met, I'm Brian. Welcome. We're glad that you're here. Thanks for everybody joining us online and all of our campuses. I always like to send a shout out to our St. Croix campus. Miss you guys. That's like my old stomping ground. So hope you guys are doing well. If we have not met, here's a few things about me. A little bit of background. I'm 45. I've got a beautiful wife and two wonderful daughters. Here's a picture of them. I grew up on a farm and I love sports. My two favorite sports teams, the Minnesota Twins and the Minnesota Vikings, remind me every day that there's more to life than sports. But I learned that pretty early on. When I was in 7th grade, I got to go out for football for the very first time. And I learned really fast that I loved football. I didn't love football so much as I just liked to hit people. Who knew that you could go for 2 hours after school and just hit people and not get in trouble? So I was loving football practice. What I was not loving at that time in my life so much was schoolwork. Not the most fun thing ever. I remember one specific assignment in 7th grade. It's the only assignment that I remember in my lifetime of academia. Academia, that's like a fancy word that people who've gone to school say. So the one thing that I remember, this one assignment, I remember it today because I forgot it then. And here's what it was. I had to create a dictionary. I got to pick a topic. I picked basketball as my topic. And I had to I had to define 30 terms that had to do with basketball. So like free throw, I had to define it, double dribble, those types of things. Here was the deal. It came for the day to hand it in. Actually, it was the last day to hand in the assignment, and I had done no work. Not even a little bit of work. I had done so little work that my classmates were already getting their dictionary assignment back with their grades, and I had not done any work. And so I had two options. My first option was this: go to the teacher, say, hey, I messed up. Like I didn't manage my time well. I didn't get it done. Can I get an extension? That sounded like a terrible option, so I didn't do that one. Option number two, as I sat at my desk, I looked to my right to an unattended desk of my classmate where there was a finished copy of a dictionary that they had done. So I decided to grab that one, color the front of it, put my name on it, and hand it in. Nobody's ever accused me of being a criminal mastermind. And I learned this early on because I got busted in the time it took me to ride the bus home. I walked in the house and Mom said, we're going back to the school. You cheated. And I'm like, that sounds about right. So hopped back in the car and we got back to school. And here's why I tell you this story, because I learned that there's more to life than sports. My punishment, I had to quit 7th grade football. And so there went my Vikings career, and here we are today. So here's why I tell you this, because our topic today is something that affects all of us. Whether you're a 7th grade football player, or you're a retiree, or you're a stay-at-home mom, whatever this looks like for you, integrity affects all of us. Integrity is what we're talking about. And the Bible has a lot to say about integrity. Here's a verse from the book of Proverbs. Here it comes. I promise. The godly walk with integrity. Blessed are their children who follow them. The godly walk with integrity. Pretty straightforward. If you're godly, you walk with integrity. That's an active verse. It's not passive. It's not saying, hey, if you're godly, you talk about integrity. It's not saying if you're godly, you preach about integrity. If you're godly, you walk with integrity. In your decisions, it is active. And so it's not the most sexy topic in the world, but as we take time to actually consider our own personal integrity, we figure out really quickly that integrity doesn't affect just us. It affects the people around us and usually the people closest to us. Think about the building process. Your home, a high-rise office building, this building here, or wherever you're watching the message from, all of those buildings were built with a certain set of guidelines. They had to reach a certain code. They had to be up to code so that they could be deemed safe for use. And not just safe for when they were built, but safe for continued use over time. There had to be a structural integrity and a continual structural integrity to all of the buildings that we use today. Here's a definition for structural integrity. It's the ability of a structure to withstand its intended load without failing due to fracture or fatigue. Let me read it one more time. The ability of a structure to withstand its intended load without failing due to fracture or fatigue. Back in 2007, my family and I, we were living in the Twin Cities, and it was late in the day. I'd just gotten home from work, and I started making dinner, turned the news on, and it was just going on in the background. And as the news was happening, they broke in on their own newscast with breaking news of a tragedy that had happened in downtown Minneapolis. And the tragedy was this: the I-35 interstate that goes right past downtown Minneapolis, there's a bridge right there, and that bridge had collapsed. Well, when I heard this, I immediately grabbed my phone and I tried to call my brother because he worked in downtown Minneapolis. And when I called his number, I couldn't get through. It was a network error message because everybody in the Twin Cities who had loved ones downtown Minneapolis, lived there or worked near there, they were all trying to call their loved ones. And so for what seemed like an eternity, we tried to call John, and we kept getting this busy signal, this, hey, network's overloaded, we can't get through. Finally, about an hour later, my brother called and he said, hey, I'm fine. I got out a little bit early today. I wasn't on that stretch of road. However, on that day in 2007, 13 people lost their lives, and 145 people were injured because of the collapse, because the bridge couldn't bear its intended load. And you see, a bridge, like a building, a bridge is built of a number of different parts. And how many parts on that bridge failed? Only one. Only one part of that bridge failed. And when that part failed, it transferred its intended load to another part of the bridge, and it couldn't handle it. And so the entire thing collapsed. And you can probably see where I'm going with this. But when we have a failure of personal integrity, the load that you were meant to carry or the load that I was meant to carry is now transferred to somebody else. Think about this at school. If you're working on a group project and you don't do your job, your part of the work for the group, now what you were intended to carry, that load, that stress has been transferred to your classmates. Think about it at work. If you just randomly don't show up for your shift, what you were intended to carry has now been transferred to somebody else. You see, our consequences are never isolated. And it's one thing to have a failure of personal integrity at school or at work, but you felt this closer than that, haven't you? Parents out there, how many of you have had an older child make a terrible decision? They've had a failure of integrity, and now you and your spouse are fighting over how to respond. And now you're carrying a burden you weren't meant to carry, and the weight of that burden is causing stress and cracks in your relationship. Or maybe you're the child and your parent had a failure of integrity, and now you've been asked to grow up a lot faster than you should have been asked to. You're dealing with adult conflicts and adult issues and adult decisions that you weren't intended to be a part of. And that's putting a weight on you. And now that's showing in your schoolwork or at your job. My wife's a teacher, and anytime she has a student who's doing well in school and suddenly their schoolwork changes and they're doing poorly, what does she always ask? What does any teacher ask? I wonder what's going on at home. Because whenever we have a failure of integrity, it doesn't just affect us, it affects those closest to us, it affects the things around us. The load is always transferred, and that's just the way it is. But the opposite is true too. If you keep your integrity, if you maintain your integrity, you carry the load you were intended to carry. That has a positive effect on those closest to you so that they can flourish and they can do the things that they carry the things they're supposed to carry. Before we go any further, I think we need a definition for personal integrity. And my favorite one comes from Pastor Andy Stanley. I stole it from him. I also took some of this content from his wonderful message series on integrity. It says this: doing what you ought to, even when it costs you. Integrity is doing what you ought to, even when it costs you. Because there's a difference between doing what you ought to when it costs you and when there's a benefit for you. Doing what you ought to, doing the right thing when there's a benefit to you, anybody would do that, right? Like even the worst person in the world would do that. They would just do it because there's a benefit. But doing what you should do, doing what you ought to when it costs you, that's a whole different thing. That takes a big decision. That takes courage to do that. Maybe integrity is something that you preach at your work. Maybe you're the boss and integrity is a big part of what you guys do. But man, integrity is a lot easier when things are going well, and it's a lot tougher when you accidentally double charged your client and now you got to give that money back. Well, it wasn't really your fault. They didn't notice, right? Well, then integrity is a little squishy. Or integrity is a conviction for you until you're pretty sure you've met the one. And if you've met the one, well, then you might as well fool around because you got to see if you're compatible. Do we do what we ought to when it costs us, or do we do what we ought to only when it benefits us? Think of our society today. How many political figures have changed a position because public opinion has shifted? And now doing what they ought to simply is what everybody says they ought to? How many parents out there now allow their youngest child to get away with something their oldest child never would have gotten away with? I now go to bed before my 10th grade daughter, which was unthinkable 2 years ago when my oldest was in 10th grade. Next week, I'm going to be doing a message about lazy fathers and their effect on children. We'll see how that goes. I'm just kidding. I'm not doing that because that would be an autobiography. So here's what I want to do with the rest of our time. I want us to consider two truths. One will help us determine our personal integrity, and the other will help us become people of integrity. And the first truth I want us to consider is this: you don't decide the ought to. You don't decide the ought to. So remember when I got caught cheating in school? My mom threw me in the car. She didn't throw me in the car. We got in the car. We headed to school. And we sat in front of the teacher where I got to listen to, and my mom got to listen to the teacher tell exactly how I had cheated and the lengths at which the teacher had gone to find out how I had cheated. And she wasn't exactly Sherlock Holmes, because here's how she caught me. That assignment that I had taken for my neighbors was already an assignment that had been corrected and graded. And I did not look at the back page of it where the big bright red letters said A and great job, Missy. And so the front of it said Brian on it, and the back said great job, Missy. And the teacher was like, I wonder what's going on here. And so I got busted. And my teacher looked at me and she said, Brian, why did you do this? And I just kind of sheepishly said, oh, you caught me. I lied. But what's the big deal with lying? I said, nobody cares about lying. That is not what I said, because nobody ever makes the argument that lying doesn't matter. You know what I did? I lied about lying. I was like, I don't know. I thought it was mine. And so I continued to lie and throw another lie on another lie. And the funny thing is oftentimes we lie about being a liar so that people won't think that we're liars. Or have you ever lied to cover up a lie so people don't think that you lie? And if you haven't done that, my guess is that you are lying right now about covering up a lie for a lie. That's just the way it is. You see, I didn't make up the rules. I don't make my stomach do flips when I have a failure of personal integrity. My stomach does that on its own. And so the question is, who decides the ought to? Well, I don't decide it. That's outside of me. Something outside of me decides what's right and what's wrong. Let's go back to the verse from Proverbs. The godly walk with integrity. Blessed are their children who follow them. Now, as I was looking at this verse this week, I felt like this verse was backwards. It felt like there should have been an if and a then. I thought it should have said, if you walk with integrity, then you're godly. If you walk in integrity. But it doesn't say that. Godliness comes first. It doesn't say if you have integrity, then you're godly. It says the godly walk with integrity. And if the godly walk with integrity, then it's God's attribute, not mine. I don't get to decide what integrity is. I don't get to decide what's right and wrong. God does that, and if it's his attribute, he gets to decide the ought to, not me, which that generally doesn't go well in our world today because we want to decide the ought to. We want to decide what's right and wrong. And yet clearly here God's saying, hey, if you are godly, you are going to walk with integrity because that is one of my attributes. And so as you grow in that and as I grow in that and we start to make decisions that we ought to even when it costs us money, or we start to make decisions that we ought to even when it costs us time or position, then we don't have integrity. We actually become people of integrity. Because God says, yes, that's my attribute. I can give that to you. You are godly because I've made it so. And so the first truth I want us to remember is that we don't get to decide the ought to. We want to talk around that a lot, and we want to hem and haw, and we want to say things are gray a lot. But God's the one that gets to decide the ought to. The second truth that I want us to consider is this: the small things matter. The small things, when it comes to integrity, matter. And remember our definition, ought to, even when it costs you. Back in 1994, I was a senior in high school. I went to a small high school, and so all the teachers knew all the students knew all the students, all the students knew all the teachers, vice versa. Everybody knew everybody. And I remember this particular day because it was beautiful outside, and I was a senior, and I had open lunch, and so I was really excited to head out off campus and go eat lunch somewhere. But one of my favorite teachers, Mrs. McClatchy, she was a science teacher. I was no science savant by any means, but she made class fun. And so Mrs. McClatchy grabbed me and she said, hey, Brian, could you, and she grabbed another classmate of mine, could you guys over lunch go wash my car? And I thought, that's kind of a bummer job. I don't know that I want to do that. However, then I remembered that her car was a brand new 1994 Pontiac Firebird, and I was very excited to go wash her car. And I said, Mrs. McClatchy, I'm your guy. You can trust me. We can do this. And she goes, great. I've just got a couple of rules. And we're like, okay, what are the rules? So, okay, here, you got to drive the speed limit, and you got to drive straight to the car wash and straight back. And I'm like, done. We are your guys. You needed guys of integrity to do a job like this. We're your guys. So we headed out, went to the car wash. It wasn't very far away. It was a small town. We got done with the car wash, and we're driving out of it. And I looked at my classmate, and I said, it feels like this car needs more time to air dry. And so rather than turning right to go back to school, we turned left and headed out of town. And this is what I know about the 1994 Pontiac Firebird. It air dries really fast, really, really fast. And so a few minutes later, we cruised back into the school parking lot and headed up to Mrs. McClatchy's room and threw the keys back to her and said, hey, we got it. It's clean, no spots on it. It's dried perfectly. You let us know when you need us to wash your car again. And as I was walking out of the room, she goes, oh, Brian? I said, yeah. You just drove straight to the car wash and straight back to school, right? And I paused for a second and looked her right in the eye and said, of course. And that brings a question to my mind. Have you ever compromised your integrity to protect your reputation as someone who has integrity? Have you ever compromised your integrity to protect your reputation as someone who has integrity? I mean, it's pretty easy just to leave out a few details or outright lie like I did. But oftentimes, this is what we do. And to say it even in a simpler way, we would rather be bad than look bad. We would rather be bad than look bad. Our fear of looking bad actually causes us to do the bad thing that we're afraid people will think about us. We would rather be bad than look bad in these moments when we have a small decision to make of whether we're going to hold on to our integrity or give it away. You see, the small things matter with integrity. And as we finish up, I want us to hear a story from the Old Testament. A story of Joseph, not Jesus' father Joseph, but Joseph back in Genesis. He had a bunch of brothers, and this Joseph, his brothers sold him into slavery. One, because they were jealous, and two, because Joseph was kind of a punk at that age. And so they sold him into slavery, and he gets bought by a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar realizes pretty quickly that Joseph is a good worker. And so he promotes him. In fact, it says this in Genesis 39. So he, Potiphar, soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. It goes on to say, so Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, Potiphar didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. And so for Joseph, things are going really great. I mean, he's still a slave, but he has risen to a high position. He's got a ton of respect. He's got a ton of influence. He is like the right-hand man. In fact, in many ways, he's making the decisions for the household. And so Potiphar noticed that about him and is like, I'm going to put you in this position. But he wasn't the only one that noticed Joseph. Somebody else noticed Joseph. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man. Time out. In my biography, someday, if somebody could write about me, I was a well-built and handsome young man, that'd just be wonderful. Time in. Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. And so Potiphar's wife notices Joseph as well, and she doesn't ask, she demands. She said, come and sleep with me. Here's how Joseph responds. He says, why would I do that? If I did that, I would sin against God and I would sin against my master. You remember him? He's your husband. And so he thought he made a pretty good argument. And yet she continues. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. So the question is, do the small things matter? And for some of you, you'd probably say, well, not giving into lust, that's a pretty big thing, and I see your point. However, the things that Joseph did to keep out of that, to keep from falling into lust, were small things. He simply said no, and then notice the end of the verse. He kept out of her way as much as possible. That's a really small thing that Joseph did. Notice what he also didn't do. He didn't play along. He didn't flirt with her. He didn't assume or really love the attention that she was giving him. He just tried to stay out of her way as much as possible. Back in 2007, when the I-35 bridge collapsed, a huge investigation ensued. It took 5 months for the authorities to kind of figure out what happened, and they went over every piece of that bridge. Every piece of the wreckage was looked at and combed through, and they came to find out that something called a gusset plate was what failed. Now, the gusset plate is a small part of a bridge. It's that piece there that connects the steel beams together, all those rivets on it. In comparison to the rest of the bridge, it's actually really small. There's gusset plates in this room right now and in your house holding up your rafters. And the deal with this collapse is that only one gusset plate failed. One gusset plate, very small, wasn't able to carry the load that it was intended to carry. And when it couldn't do that, it transferred the weight of what it was to carry onto the next piece of the bridge, and the entire thing collapsed. So do the small things matter in your life? When you're making the decision between maintaining your integrity and giving it away, I would say the small things really matter. The small things matter because the small things can carry weight. The small things matter because the small things carry weight. And because they carry weight, the small things soon become big things. What I didn't tell you about Joseph's story is how it ended. Joseph gets thrown into prison, not because he slept with Potiphar's wife, but because she lied about him. She lied about him, and because he wouldn't sleep with her, she lied and said he attacked her and gets thrown into prison. He maintained his integrity, and man, did it cost him. It costed him his freedom. He didn't know what the outcome would be, and yet he maintained his integrity. And here's what I want us to understand. At some point, when we give away our integrity, when we trade it for something, there will come a point where we will have neither of those things. I trade my integrity for some money. At some point, that money's gone, and so is my integrity. I trade my integrity to flirt with the new cute coworker, and I act on that. At some point, the excitement of that moment is gone, and so is my integrity. The one thing I could have kept is gone as well. See, the small things carry weights, and so the small things turn into big things. The question I've kept asking myself this week over and over and over and over, Brian, is your integrity up to code? Brian, is your integrity able to withstand what the world can throw at you? Is your integrity at a spot where when the enemy decides, I want to attack you, you'll make the small decisions in a good way? And I ask you the same thing. What have you been deciding on recently? What's the world been throwing at you? And maybe you've already made the decision that this week you're going to do X. Would you know that the small things matter? That the small things carry weight? And on the positive side, when you maintain that, when you keep your integrity, those around you are blessed by it because you're carrying the weight you were intended to, so that they can carry the weight they were intended to. And in that, we become more like God. Let's pray. Father, my prayer for each and every person in this room would be, and each and every person that's listening online or at our campuses, God, my prayer would be that we would walk with integrity today, that you would give us the courage that we need to make the small decisions, because those are really, really hard, especially when nobody else is going to know. Father, would you help us to maintain our integrity so that we can have a legacy that we leave behind? God, would we know today that we're loved by a king, loved by one who thought so much of us that he would go to the cross for us? God, my prayer would be that each and every one of us realize and understand that love today. So I pray for your Spirit to show us that, give us courage to make the right decisions. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Hey everyone, it's Adam from Embrace. If you enjoyed today's message, make sure to subscribe to Embrace's YouTube channel to stay updated. You can also click here to check out other videos. Thanks for watching.